John Parks. He's going to have a talk on looking at the sea.
Great, thank you. Well, it's going to be very difficult to follow these two excellent presentations, both by the last optical mining team and Dr. French's discussion around propellants. And then Ms. Irons gave a really compelling talk about irradiated regolith and looking at succession. One thing I'll point out is that both of those talks are about human foraging. They're about human behavior extracting or using the available environment off-world for human use, which is a perfect setup for what I'm going to be talking about today, which is really about human extraction and human behavior. And so jumping ahead, if we assume that we'll solve the technological issues, and as we have in the past, what can we learn from terrestrial analogs in terms of our behavior of foraging and extraction and apply that as we leave the Earth? So the talk today is Look to the Sea. My name is John Parks. I'm from Hawaii, so I had to throw in the proverbial shot of the double-hulled traditional Polynesian voyaging canoe. We just finished a 3-year voyage using traditional technologies. The person this morning mentioned that it was the Westerners who were the first to seafare. They were incorrect. It actually is the Polynesians. And, but around the same time, about 1,500 years ago. And both Polynesians who brought their technology, their hardware, and their bioware, their food plants that we heard Ms. Irons talk about, as well as the Westerners, they brought what they needed with them. And as we look ahead, we're going to be needing to do the same thing. This is really about humans more than it is about space. I'm an ecologist by training. I'm a marine scientist. Why is a marine scientist at a Mars meeting? That's a good question. I think, already this morning in the plenary, we heard people using references to maritime authority and the sea. Our existing understanding of far remote areas that are removed from a centralized control is the sea. Not to mention that really 3/4 of the planet is water, is ocean. Over 95% of our biosphere, living space, is marine. So really, we're a marine species who a while back crawled out, and we are going off-world, and so we really need to think about our biome at home as we go. I'm going to cover 5 points today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. Why am I here? We're going to look at a little comparison between offshore and off-world. I want to propose a framework to help us think about moving forward beyond this talk. A few lessons learned from the marine setting of how humanity has learned how to manage scarce, high-value marine resources. No optical fracking going on there yet. And then we're talking about, I have 3 recommendations I'd like to pose to this society. So let's start with a few definitions. I'm an ecologist. I've never been to the Mars Society meeting, so sometimes I hear terminology. So I'm trained to sort of always introduce what I'm talking about. Common pool resources, or the commons as you often will hear them, these are natural resources. They're so remotely located that sometimes they're almost inaccessible until technology comes along. They're so challenging to manage that it's hard for people to centrally control them. So there's no property rights yet there. John Locke did a good job hundreds of years ago describing property theory. This still holds today, and it really, really holds. This concept really holds off-world. The second is the social or socio-ecological system. This is us, guys. This is you and me in the habitat that we live in, that our environs, our physical, geological, the chemical, atmospheric composition around us that we operate in, sometimes seemingly unknowingly. And that's the unit of the physical structure plus those incremental pieces of actors and institutions from humanity. These systems, these socio-ecological systems, highly complex. They adapt through time. And we can see from the Tuareg people in the middle of the Sahara to colleagues that I work with in remote atolls in Tonga, humanity is really good at adapting, and they're fantastic when they're put in challenging socio-ecological situations. So the methods, how did we get here? How is it that we're coming to this discussion around learning from humanity's use and management of marine resources and thinking a little bit offshore? First, for the last 10 years, we've been really deeply investigating the link between high-value, scarce resources, living and non-living, in remote locations, and all of human behavior, conflict, competition, and foraging. And during that period of time, we've looked first to Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. The ASEAN countries is the heart, the pumping aorta of Asia. And in these nations, we took a little less than a decade to really look closely at the resources that are being extracted from those systems. We looked at about nearly 600 communities that are extracting marine resources. And then we went on to look at West Africa. This was by design. West Africa was coming out of a couple decades of very bloody conflict, and we got pulled into some DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants, mostly child soldiers who had grown up, and getting them into fishing boats because they had no education, and getting them out to extract. So this gave us a really good set, both in post-conflict West Africa and in Southeast Asia. It gave us a good idea of how humanity goes out, extracts, and what we're learning about that process, particularly the farther out you go. When we observed and measured human behavior in these systems, what we find is predictive. Our null hypothesis that despite being in Southeast Asia or West Africa or even here in California, that our null hypothesis that behavior associated with our foraging of natural resources is not predictable. There's evidence now that shows it's just the opposite, whether it's in timber, the atmosphere, drinking water, and fisheries. One thing that we see is that there are predictive, behavioral-driven factors that really help us understand what is going to come. Some of those are remoteness and scarcity, so think about off-world. Both remoteness and scarcity are sort of the technologically limiting factors. Governance and how resources, particularly common resources that don't have a centralized authority looking over them, that's a hugely important, statistically significant factor in terms of how much conflict and optimal foraging occurs over those natural resources. The socioeconomics, things like religion, things we did not predict, religious affiliation, age, and also looking at people's background in terms of their cultural identity. These things are significantly correlated with how resources at remote distances are extracted and whether or not they lead to conflict or they lead to optimization. Food security is another one. This is a factor that we see here on Earth in remote settings where there's removal from humanity. Food security is a huge predictor as to whether or not we have sustainable, optimal foraging and use of resources that are present. All of these things are at a 95% confidence interval. They're statistically significantly correlated with peace and order. Meaning that where humanity extracts its natural resources to persist wherever we are, and particularly when you do a multivariate regression, you add these factors together, it is a predeterminant of peace and order. This is really important for us to think about as we move off-world. Maybe, like Ms. Irons said, maybe we figure out how to take that irradiated regolith and get those plants growing. And like we heard from the last two speakers, maybe we figure out the propellant and the extractive industries through optical mining. But once that happens, what can we learn in terms of human behavior in those activities here that we should be thinking about now before we go? So interestingly, when we look at all these factors and we look clearly and carefully at the relationship between the factors, we see three things fall out that is somewhat intuitive, but once we have the math behind it, it really helps that clarity. We see, on the one hand, where you have scarce resources, in this case fisheries, high-value fisheries, but it also applies to petroleum, as some of my colleagues have done in the Gulf of Guinea, where there's high piracy, as well as manganese nodules. There's a huge industry that's coming behind this. So where we have resource scarcity coupled with remoteness, that scarcity tends to drive competition. Competition flourishes, and it brings out the best in our species. But once scarcity and competition are added together, once you look at the multivariate, the multiple compound influence, it drives conflict. Conflict not just in terms of armed conflict, but also just unrest and maritime crime. These things are this cycle here is statistically related through time, and it's a feedback loop. It gets worse through time. This is an important lesson for us to consider as we go off-world. More recently, some of us have been pulled into some of the US policy related to scarcity and resources, in this case, fisheries. Some of you go to the supermarket, you buy your seafood, it tastes good, you may not always wonder where it's coming from. There are a few studies recently that show that up to 60 to 70% of your seafood is both mislabeled and is coming illegally to you. That's a lot in the US economy. So under the Obama administration, Secretary Kerry and the Obama administration launched an initiative. They said, look, we want to stop seafood, illegal seafood and slavery that's associated with the seafood trade, especially in Southeast Asia. And so through USAID, a few of us have been pulled into an initiative to look at human welfare. I would postulate that in 100 years, someone will be talking about this with respect to mining of rare minerals, of water from off-world, beyond LEO. Also, based off this experience, we know that very recently, this is the last few years, I was fortunate to be part of a team that was pulled in by the Nippon Foundation, contracted to help them think about what's going on in the world with the oceans, and then think about the future. And Nippon Foundation, through the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations have set forward for 2050 for Earth, we found four, if you look at the literature and you look at the evidence, the scientific evidence that's available to us, there are four trends. First is that there's a need to promote governance of the high seas, which used to be a commons and increasingly is being extracted by those that have the capital to get there. Second is pushing for this blue economy, which may be a black economy in the future with space. This blue economy, there are some issues around human equity and, in fact, human justice. And we need to push for justice reform there. Third is curbing overexploitation of certain types of high-value commodities and the associated supply chain that comes with that, the illegal supply chain. And then finally is to attract financing into this space to make sure that these things are secure. And the chairman of the Nippon Foundation, on the first day of the UN conference in June, he said, and he works very closely, he's essentially part of the Japanese administration, who leans very heavily on Nippon Foundation. And he said that Japan is moving forward with a bold initiative to do this. And in working with the Nippon Foundation, I know that their sites are on high seas now, but they're looking off-world. So we have a bit of background of why is the world thinking about oceans as we look to the heavens? Here's the question: what have we learned from managing Earth's oceans that we should be able to apply for, strategically think about in terms of moving off-world, in this case to Mars? So let's do a comparison. If we look at simple set of attributes, some common characteristics about these systems. So on the left-hand column here, you'll see this is offshore, defined as greater than 200 nautical miles offshore. So you have to go out, right? For those of us, I used to work at NOAA, the Federal Agency for Oceans, and spent months at sea. And this is what you're talking about here, when you're offshore. And here's off-world, which is much more harsh, extreme, remote. Let's look at a few of the comparative factors. Remoteness, here offshore, it's still remote, but technology's allowed us to get a better handle of how to get out there. Whereas off-world, if you had a 3-point ranking, with 3 is the extreme and 0 is easy, it's still a fairly tough nut to crack. That remoteness factor is still in play. The inhospitability, the hostility of the natural environment that you persist, here on offshore, we've really started to figure this out. It's still a tough environment. For those of us that have gotten stuck out there before, it challenges you. But we figured it out, whereas off-world, it's extremely challenging. The presence of high-value natural resources. Here at home, we know that the Earth is rich with living and non-living marine resources. And we're starting to discover that off-world there's a supply there as well, that some of the people in this room are really looking toward. If we think about the needs of humanity and society, this is food security, sustainability, populations, where are we going to put our people? You know that offshore, there's been talk about moving people offshore and having them live offshore and thinking about food security offshore through pens of aquaculture. For off-world, there's some initial thinking about this, that off-world may serve to meet the needs of humanity. Technological requirements to get to remote settings on Earth and off-world are both high. We've figured, in terms of technological requirements, in 100 years, we've really come a long way on that. And then the perception of these places being a new frontier, really speaks to the character, the nature of our species. Both are considered frontiers to be mastered. I would say that we still have a ways to go to get the general population on board with that. And then finally, both are largely commons. They're ungoverned. There is out of the UN meeting in May, there's now a proposed update to one of the oldest treaties, which is the Law of the Sea Treaty, to actually make the high seas no longer a commons and make it governed formally. So let's look at a framework to help us move forward. In this socio-ecological system where there's a physical unit of natural resources, and you have people, actors, and institutions, these are complex adaptive systems. Examples are wetlands or the oceans, a sea of water, or even a planetary biome like the tundra. Elinor Ostrom, Dr. Ostrom, she proposed using the following framework to analyze resource systems, the units, the governance of those systems and units, the users, and to look at the interactions and outcomes between this. She points out, she's an economist by training, and she pointed out that there are exogenous variables. There are things outside the system that have influenced it, political, socioeconomics, and neighboring ecosystems. Maybe it's a biome next door. And if we use Ostrom's framework, we can really begin to think carefully about where we're going and why. There are a few implications to her framework. First, it challenges the notion of the tragedy of the commons. We have thrown that out. We know that in commons, when you have early actors and institutions, they will move to self-regulate. So this is a really important finding in the last 30 years, is that even in a situation with commons, as a species, we're really good about self-regulation. Also, common resources don't always need a central authority. They don't always need policy guidance. People will move and migrate toward norms, behavioral norms, and setting up rules and regulations on their own, even at a local level. Her work on this framework earned her the Nobel Prize. This is a big deal. And we really need to think about this before we go off and do optical mining and propellants and irradiated regolith growing, right? We need to think about the governance implications. Let's look through a few lessons learned. So if we were to think about the resource system in Ostrom's framework, one lesson that we've learned in the oceans is that we should take an ecosystem approach. Mrs. Irons hit the nail on the head on this, right? She was talking optimal foraging and growing in an ecosystem, a Martian ecosystem that's being terraformed at the soil level. And we really need to take that ecosystem approach of looking, instead of a single resource like manganese in the sea or platinum in an asteroid, we need to take an ecological approach. We've learned this. This is well documented. From a resource unit, one of the lessons we learned from the oceans is that we must have a system that is traceable and that you have to have a verification in your supply chain, which we've heard in the last two discussions. Supply chains are going to be critical as we get off world. Those supply chains for high value remote resources, we've learned they must be traceable in real time and they must be verifiable. That will require data systems to be automated. And that means we're going to have infrastructure in place, think of Iridium satellites, but out off-world, in order to sustain those resources. Here's an example from Asia where harvest capture in the middle of the Pacific tuna in real time can be traced all the way to Whole Foods when you go to the supermarket in Bethesda, Maryland. From a governance perspective, we know from the ocean experience, we know that when you have common resources, people need to be trained on how to govern those resources independently of others. Here's Tonga. This is an atoll community that I'm asked to work in by the Tongan government. These people are autonomous. They're living on their own. They don't have outside help. And we know that these systems, Ostrom's model shows that these systems can, with certain conditions, they can flourish for a long time, remotely and without support. That's a really important lesson for us to think carefully about as we move off-world. From the users, the people involved, we need to be realistic. We have to learn from our own mistakes here at home. We have to really think about this carefully. We need to think about social sustainability, human welfare, and equity. These are significantly contributing, causal sometimes, factors in unrest and conflict. These are fishing communities from the Philippines. This is an enforcer from Indonesia. We know from Earth's experience with remote, high-value resources that we need to think carefully about how those users operate within the system. Are they included in the system? Is it the haves or have-nots, or are they somehow included? And how do we make sure that there's an opportunity for them to have equity? A few last lessons. It's really important when we're interacting in this whole system to take a precautionary approach. We know from the ecological management, and some would say the attempted management of the ecology of Earth, that depletion and scarcity are things that we're up against on a daily basis now. And so we need to think about what are the different tools we've learned about managing scarce resources at distance. This is a network of the largest marine protected areas on Earth, which a few years ago did not exist, and today accounts for about 7% of the ocean surface under protection. So we know that there are certain tools that we can begin to use as we go offshore to conserve. 3 recommendations before I close. First, I would propose that this society, being new to it, it's easy for me to propose stuff, right? I promise I will volunteer to help. I would propose that this society really look at the Ostrom model, which is the model that she not only earned the Nobel Prize for, but it describes forestry systems, it describes fishery systems, mining systems all over the Earth. Let's think about that, at least give it a try before we go off-world. Maybe this society can produce something written about this, about the lessons from natural resource management on Earth as humanity marches off. That seems like something that this society would be really good at doing. All of you in the room would be able to contribute to that. You all have something to offer there. And then finally, we need a strategy. If we find that there is knowledge that, yes, human behavior is more predictive than we think when it comes to high-value, remote, scarce resources, then we should build a strategy for human habitation that carefully considers those attributes, those factors. We should think about this. Technology can get away from us, we get excited, but we need to be careful and thoughtful. So I just want to stop here. I want to thank the MacArthur Foundation and Nippon Foundation, USAID. These are the folks that have supported my research, and my 3 colleagues here. Thank you very much. Okay, the moderator says we have time for a question or 2. Yes, sir.
Can you say something about property in the context of all
So this is a great question. The question is about property rights off-world. So if we look, and what I'll do is I'll speak to the marine experience. So if we look at places that are remote in the oceans where technology has allowed people to go there, in the last 50 years, we've seen a proliferation of property rights associated with those resources, even when they're remote. If you think about politics today, you look at some of the nations in Asia as they move into uninhabited atolls that are contested in the EEZs and start building military bases. You know, property rights, there's an expanding direction of property rights, and I would assume that with the high seas soon to be governed with property rights, it will be natural to see at Leo and then beyond natural migration of human property rights beyond Earth orbit. This is a trajectory we've been on for a long time. There are Ostrom, she would tell us, if she were alive, I think Dr. Ostrom would tell us that the governance model for Mars will be simple. It's going to be small settlements that are very busy, eking out a subsisting, essentially, in the truest sense, making those daily repairs to subsist and survive and thrive. And that they will, because of remoteness and the lack of a centralized authority, they will learn with their neighbors to govern because of the scarcity of the resources. And I think we need to prepare for that model, even if we want a different model, even if we want to plant a flag and have a centralized authority there. Sure.
Did law of the sea hinder commercialization, or did it delay commercialization in the ocean world long enough to establish decent rules and regulations?
That's a fantastic, very philosophical question. I would say it's somewhere in the middle. If we look at the law of the sea, the United Nations has decided to update the law of the sea to go beyond exclusive economic zone. And under Article 123 of that provision of the treaty, which all the countries have signed, requires international cooperation in commons areas. Building on that, we're going to see, the commons, first the high seas, the surface area, and then eventually the deep sea areas, and then finally the seabed will be managed through a regime, a governance regime. It took the 40 years to get there. And one of the issues that we had getting started with UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea, is that we didn't have the foresight of looking behind. In this case, we do. And there are a few people here and overseas that are looking at doing an UNCLOS for off-world. I think we won't need the 40 years of lead time. Do we have time for one more? Okay.
The time is whether the analogy with the sea is a good one, because, well, it makes sense to think of outer space as a common. Natural worlds seem to fall more into the legal concept of terra nullius,
Yes.
things that are unknown that anyone can occupy.
Right.
Which
Maritime law, if we look at maritime law, for example, the sort of possession is 9/10 of the law, that ability to occupy a space, even salvage law, is a good analogy for this. I do think that we'll probably, once we have settlement, right now, I think you're correct, but once we have settlement, I think we're going to be moving much more to a shared commons approach, where we have, if you look at common resource pool theory, once you have users in that system that are subsisting and persisting on the resources, the resource units and the resources that are available, those rules will get set up so that we'll actually move to a different de jure, a different legal approach. I think you're right that it will take more time than we think, and that until then it may be more of a res communis. It'll be more of a whoever is occupying the area. Good question.
Yes. Is there, when you spoke on the level of remoteness, is there a certain distance, for instance, where people go, such as people in Boston said, I don't care what you think in England, so if we're on opposite sides of Mars, some people seem to not be for flag planting.
Right.
So is there a certain, level of remoteness where people go, I don't care what you think, we're doing our own thing?
What's your background?
Exercise science.
So this is I would say that of all the questions that this society has to struggle with, this question about remoteness as a factor in how we move off world has got to be one of the top 3 or 4 of the most important questions to ask. That's why I was asking your background. This question about remoteness is studied deeply, mostly by folks in the military sciences. I sit on a group called Minerva, which is part of the Department of Defense, looking at deep questions about this. Can we predict, looking at algorithms, do we know how human behavior is predictive under certain distances? Once you add in sort of physical isolation, psychological, these distances change. It's a multivariate, not a single causality. And the remoteness factor may be different off-world than it is here. And I think most people would say that remoteness would be maybe exponentially more of an important factor, even if the supply chains are in place between LEO and Mars. This question about remoteness is going to be one of the key principal determinants of how fast we move.
That's all we got.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.